Our first presenter is just getting set up right now. Her name is Dr. Pearson. She's from the Women's Studies and Feminist Research Department, and she'll be giving a talk on Josephine Baker, entitled Josephine Baker, Celebrity, Civil Rights Activist, Resistance Fighter. So let's give a nice warm welcome to Dr. Pearson.
Thanks, and welcome on this rainy morning. I think you're going to get drenched on your way home. Does anybody here know who Josephine Baker is? Okay. That's not surprising. A lot of people have forgotten her. But at one time, Josephine Baker was the highest paid woman entertainer in the world. Right? And I think when we think about celebrity, we often think predominantly of white celebrities. And I think this is a time in history when it's important to reclaim people from other cultures who were equally important in their day as the people we do remember, right? So in this case, because we're talking about celebrities from the first half of the 20th century, it might be, in fact, that you know none of them. Does anybody know Greta Garbo? Okay, Marlene Dietrich? A few nods, okay. So those names are a little bit more familiar, but Josephine Baker is not familiar at all, I gather. Okay, this is actually a part of a lecture that I do for a course called Women and Popular Culture, Garbo to Gaga. Okay, so starting with Greta Garbo and moving on and finishing more or less with Gaga. And one of the things that we wanted to do was actually look at the whole range of people, women who were involved in various forms of popular culture at the time. So we start with a lecture on early celebrity. And one of the people that we talk about is Josephine Baker, because she was, in her era, one of the best known and most important people of her day. She was probably certainly the best known dancer, best known entertainer generally in all sorts of ways. I don't seem to have a remote for this. Okay, so I'm going to show you a little bit about her, and I'm actually going to start with a little clip from a biopic that was made about her, just because I want you to see the footage that shows you something about just how important she actually was. Okay. This will probably start with an ad. Do we have volume?
Just the...
Sorry.
Artists in France. This was the funeral of Josephine Baker. Until then, perhaps no one had quite understood the depth of love and admiration in which she was held throughout her adopted country. For in spite of the 21-gun salute, in spite of being the very proud holder of the Legion of Honor and the Medal of Resistance, Josephine Baker was not French. Her roots lay in the very heart of Black America.
So just a very brief clip to give you a sense of just how well loved Baker was. Okay, how well Baker was loved in her adopted country of France. So the question is, how did a young black woman who was born in 1917 in New Orleans end up in a place like France, right, becoming a world-famous superstar? And she's been called the first black superstar, and that's a pretty good label for her. She was certainly better known than pretty much any other black person of her day, and it was only later on that other people, primarily black athletes, started to supersede her. Now, of course, we're talking a period of actually fairly brutal racism, and I just want to give you a little bit of sense of where she was coming from and why she had to leave the United States in order to achieve the kind of stardom that she did in the end. Do we have just an ordinary mouse? Do you want me having to carry the keyboard around with me? Apparently not. Okay, well, I'll manage. Okay. All right, so she was born in 1906 in St. Louis, Missouri. And she died in 1975 in Paris, and what you just saw was a very brief clip of her funeral cortege, and you could see how literally thousands and thousands of people came out for her funeral. All the important political figures of the time were there. And she was really, at that point, had become a very important person. But she certainly didn't start that way. She started in the exact opposite. She became known for her dancing initially, for her singing. She was a war hero, and she was also a civil rights activist. But she was also one of the best known and best paid entertainers of her period. Okay, there were very few women in show business who could compete with her, and that's actually a remarkable thing for someone who came from her background. So I'm going to show you again, this is a little clip that gives you a sense of where she was coming from.
We don't have the words to describe the refreshing great taste.
What you see here is actually sort of a shadow of the dance that made her famous. Recreated for this, which is a biopic that was made in the early part of this century. And one of the things that made her initially very famous in France was that she did her performances very nearly in the nude.
News reached Paris this morning that Josephine Baker is on the verge of bankruptcy. Adored in Paris but banned in her native America, she was once the richest black woman who ever lived. Her years of fortune began in the 1920s with her scandalous banana dance. But now her chateau in southern France is in danger of being taken away from her. It's been the home of her 12 adopted children of all races, her rainbow tribe.
Jano.
And?
Of you from Japan.
Yari from Finland. Louis from Colombia. Moshe from Israel.
Some people in the villages around Les Milans are turning against a penniless neighbor.
Oh, I don't care about her philosophy. All I know is she has not paid one bill in 7 months.
Yesterday, Josephine said goodbye to her children, sending them to friends in Paris. Vowing to keep her dream alive, Josephine is threatening to lock herself in her medieval castle and take on all comers.
My dearest children, I want you all to know that I love you and that I've been forced to send you away. By now, you're in Paris, hearing stories about my scandalous past and crazy ideas, and I must set the record straight. I've got slave and Indian blood, which I always claimed made me more American than most people who call themselves that. So what am I doing here? So far from where I began.
This here is a castle. It's got walls 10 foot thick and 100 foot high. This here is a princess. Ain't she beautiful? She can have a pick of any prince she wants. This here is the prince she chooses. He's just about the swellest thing that ever been. You can tell he's a prince. He's got silver buckles on his shoes.
When I was trying to grow up, white folks had no heart and black folks had no power. All the little black girl had was a hard way to go.
Any niggas in here? There's some more niggas in here. Over this to here.
I started running when I was just a little baby. St. Louis on a Tuesday morning, 1917. 39 black people died that day. I got a knot in my stomach that never went away.
So there's a very big difference between where she starts and where she ends up. And so one of the things I want to talk about today is how that came about. Oops. All right. Okay, so that's a dramatization, obviously. It gives you a very good picture of the racial dynamics of the southern United States at the time that this is taking place, and the way in which she grew up, and the kind of complete lack of opportunity for people on the basis of, or simply on the basis of race that existed at the time. Right, so she flees, she ends up in New York, where she makes a career as a dancer, and partly she's able to do this because she actually was married very, very young. She married, I think, for the first time at 13, and her husbands were also able to help her. She was divorced, remarried at 15, and then left her second husband to move to France when she was given the opportunity to go and perform there. I don't think she had intended to stay in France, she'd intended to come back, but what she found in France was a very different system to what she had in the United States. So let's just talk about that a little bit, because what was operative at the time in the United States was what was called the Jim Crow laws. Have any of you heard of these? No? Interesting. Okay. So in terms of the history of racism, the Jim Crow laws were sort of the most extreme thing post-slavery. And what they were intended to do was make it very clear to African Americans that they were second-class citizens, that they had no rights, relatively speaking, and that in any interaction with white people, they were always to give way. Right? So I'm not going to read you this whole quotation, but it gives a sense of this. This is actually something I took from the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia, which is actually has the motto of using memories of intolerance to teach tolerance. It's a very interesting museum because you see exactly what people were doing at the time. Rather than reading about it, you actually see the artifacts that they were using. Right. One of which, of course, was signs. So you have all these kinds of signs: no dogs, Negroes, Mexicans, restrooms for whites only, drinking fountains that are segregated. And the level of kind of extremism that was involved in keeping the races apart was kind of extraordinary from our perspective. So Jim Crow was not simply a set of legal prescriptions, which it also was, so some of this was set into the law, but it's also a set of etiquette rules. Right? And they themselves were also fairly extreme. A black male could not offer to shake hands with a white male because it implied being socially equal. Blacks and whites were not supposed to eat together. If they did, whites were to be served first and some sort of partition to be placed between them. Under no circumstances was a black male to offer to light the cigarette of a white female. That gesture implied intimacy. Blacks were not allowed to show public affection towards one another in public, especially kissing, because it offended whites. Jim Crow etiquette prescribed that blacks were introduced to whites, never whites to blacks. For example, Mr. Peters, this is Charlie, that I spoke to you about. Okay, so you could never say, let's say Charlie's last name is Smith, you could never say Mr. Smith, this is Bill Peters, because that implied an equality that they did not want to even think about. Whites did not use courtesy titles of respect when referring to blacks, and blacks were always called by their first names, but they also always had to use courtesy titles when referring to whites, even tiny children, right? So if a black man is speaking to a 3-year-old white boy, he has to refer to him as Mr. or Master, whatever his last name is. Okay. If a black person rode in a car driven by a white person, the black person sat in the back seat or the back of a truck. White motorists had the right of way at all intersections, which must have made following the rules of the road interesting. We tend to go by lights and signs rather than by the race of the person driving the car. If you think about having to try and figure that out today, I think it would make life very complicated. It only worked in these days because there were relatively few vehicles. Okay, so that's what Josephine Baker grew up into and what she was faced with. And when she moved to New York, she didn't run into Jim Crow rules to the same extent because they were pretty much a Southern American thing. But what she did run into was other forms of racial, oops, guess I hit a few buttons here. Okay, back to Jim Crow. What she did run into was other forms of racism. The difference between the South and the North at that time was that in the North, black people could protest without necessarily facing the kind of extreme violence you saw in that incident in St. Louis in 1917. Okay? And in fact, one of the things that actually worked on Baker's behalf was that she arrived in New York at the moment of what's known as the Harlem Renaissance. Again, I'm going to ask, do you know about the Harlem Renaissance? Okay. The Harlem Renaissance was a period when Harlem, which at that time was a much more integrated place, it wasn't a predominantly black community, but it was a mix of black people, Jewish people, other immigrants, and some quote-unquote white Americans, became a center of culture, particularly music. And it was still segregated, and it had some interesting rules in terms of how black people could perform. So, curiously enough, they couldn't perform as themselves unless they were in a purely black club. If they were in a white club, they had to perform either in blackface, so that it could have been presumed that it was a white person wearing blackface, right? So blacking up and drawing cartoon lips and the whole thing, which is, very racist in and of itself, but was a very common practice in the day. Or they could perform in whiteface. So a lot of the pictures of Josephine Baker dancing from this period show her, interestingly, with her body as it is, right? So her legs are not touched, but her face has been whitened in order to make her look sort of like a white performer. These sorts of rules made life, I think, kind of interesting, but they didn't really damage the energy of what was going on there. And what was going on was a great reinvention, or a great invention of musical forms particularly, especially things like jazz. Right? So these kinds of musical forms coming out of the Harlem Renaissance moved outside of first of all, New York, Harlem to New York, from New York to the rest of the United States, and from the United States to the rest of America. So they became important and interesting aspects of what people in the rest of the world were interested in seeing, hearing, and so on and so forth. Okay, so after Baker became part of a well-known musical revue in New York, an American heiress living in New York decided to import the whole troupe to Paris to show the French what people could do. Okay, and especially this was tying into a period of very active French colonization in Africa, and consequently a kind of fascination with everything sort of African. Okay, but one of the things that happened in terms of Baker's success was that she was also being exoticized, right? So although she didn't encounter the same kind of racism in France, right? She didn't have to worry about whether she sat on the back of the bus. She didn't have to worry that the restaurant wouldn't serve her. She didn't have to worry about whether or not she could go to a hotel and book a room, any of these kinds of things. In France, there were no racial barriers from that perspective. There was still racism, right? And so one of the things that in order to succeed she had to do was to kind of exoticize herself. So she learned to do this kind of what she called savage dance, right? And one of the things she then said about this, because she was not a stupid woman by any means, she's a very bright person, was since I personified the savage on the stage, I tried to be as civilized as possible in daily life. So she's trying to make clear that one thing is a performance, it's not her, right? So it's not a matter of, it's not a function of her race, but simply a performance that she's choosing to do. And that's an important distinction. Okay, I'm going to show you another little clip, and then I think we'll have time just to wrap things up. Or not. Right. Thank link is not working. Let's see if this one up here will.
If you're only earning with the Air Miles Collector Card, you're only enjoying half the rewards. So stop missing out on rewards.
The closest that we've come in recent times is someone like Muhammad Ali. She was never afraid to speak out, to be who she was.
And she decided, I don't want to be married to Willie Baker anymore. I want to be in that show. In a way, she'd cop out the new Negro fever.
Despite the attention Josephine was starting to receive, she sensed she had progressed as far as a black woman could in 1920s America. So when she was offered the opportunity to join an all-black revue show opening in Paris, she jumped at the chance. Summoning all her courage, she was only 19, she sailed to Europe for the first time.
1925, wasn't it, when you went to Paris first of all? What was Josephine Baker like in 1925?
Josephine Baker at that moment was a very frightened girl. Yes, frightened because, you see, there were special reasons for that fright, the uncertainty. Josephine Baker was the girl who left St. Louis to come to Europe to find freedom.
That was the real Josephine Baker you saw being interviewed there.
Josephine Baker would never have gotten anywhere with her dance in Revue Negre in 1925 New York, whereas it turned 1925 Paris on its head.
Can you imagine what it must have been like when she arrived in France, where this all-black review, they're just stepped into a hotel, just normal hotel. There are no black hotels, it's just people. They can go to any restaurant they want. Can you imagine? They are considered exotic flowers, not prejudice. Well, I'm just amazed that every one of them didn't stay in France for the rest of their lives.
In France, there were no Jim Crow laws. In fact, there was a desire on the part of the French to embrace all things African.
The French were colonizing Africa at the time. The majority of people genuinely believed they were doing good things. And so Negro art was very popular.
In 1925, just months before Revue Negre, we had the Great Art Deco exhibition. So you have artists who are showing a great deal of interest in African art. And then somebody like Josephine comes along and they think that that somehow is the sculpture from their paintings that have come to life.
During rehearsals, Josephine quickly caught the attention of the producers of La Revue Negre, and they partnered her with a male dancer for a sensationally erotic duet, and, with some difficulty, persuaded her to appear as if she were naked.
She grappled with it maybe overnight and decided, okay, this is what needs to be done, I will do it. So there's something very opportunistic about her personality.
There's no film of La Revue Negre, we can't really know what it looked like or what the dance was like. But it was something that people hadn't seen before. Joey Alex, who was her dancing partner, carried her onto the stage on his back. She was lying on his back, doing the splits in the air. And then he gently let her down and she turned a sort of slow cartwheel onto the stage and stood there. In Janet Flanner's famous account years later, like a magnificent ebony statue.
Okay, so that gives you a sense of what sorts of things she was doing in the early part of her career. As she became more well-known and made more money, she was able to make her what should I say, her performance is more quote-unquote dignified. She tried, when she was very popular in France in the 1930s, to go back to the United States and discovered that very little had changed there. Although she had a lot of money and a great deal of celebrity, and so she was allowed to book rooms in important hotels with white people in cast that she was performing with, she was asked to go in by the back door. When she went to good restaurants with her white friends, they would be served and she would not. And there was a great deal of problems around her request that the audiences not be segregated. Right. So she left the States again and went to France, became a citizen in 1937, vowing basically not to return to the United States, following which, of course, war broke out. So by 1939, of course, you have the start of the Second World War, you have Hitler trying to take power, and of course, one of the groups of people he would like to get rid of is in fact all Africans or people of African descent. So, although of course we know the concentration camps best because the majority of people in them were Jewish, but there were also other racial minorities, including some black Europeans and gypsies and various people whose lifestyles or politics Hitler believed was letting down the white race, so communists, homosexuals, etc., all ended up in the concentration camps. When Hitler and his troops marched into France and ended up in Paris, Baker started working for the French resistance. She took quite a lot of risks, smuggling messages out with her sheet music, sometimes even in her underwear, and was really active as a member of the French resistance, for which at the end of the war, the French government awarded her both the Croix de Guerre and the Legion of Honor with the Rosette of the Resistance, so two of France's highest military honors. And from that point on, she was also appointed a colonel in the French Air Force and often appeared at sort of solemn public events, rather than, of course, her dance performances, wearing her military uniform as part of the reminder of this. So this is one of the things she was known for. She was also known for the fact that she believed that it was possible for different races to live in harmony. And as a way of kind of proving this, she created what she called her rainbow tribe. So she adopted 12 children, 10 boys and 2 girls from around the world, and brought them up together, and which is, of course, where we started with that, with the biopic using the letter to the children as a way for her to tell her story. And I'm just going to wrap it up with the last thing, which is that she became a very important part also of the United States civil rights activist movement, because by this point she had become so big and so famous and so important that American entertainment moguls were dying to import her back to the US, and she was able to set the terms. So she said, no, I will not perform anywhere where there is a segregated audience. All audiences have to be mixed. And especially in the southern US, especially in places like Georgia, Alabama, and even Florida, this was an extraordinary thing. And so she was able to make real progress in working towards civil rights. She also appeared on stage at times with people like Dr. Martin Luther King, and she became an important figure in the civil rights movement as well. Okay, she continued to perform until she died, and in fact, she was actually performing a concert at the point where she passed away at the age of 69. And so that is something about Josephine Baker for you to think about. Thank you.